Good afternoon. My name is John Jackson, President and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Justice is the Foundation. For over 30 years, the Schott Foundation has served as a bridge between philanthropy and grassroots education partners across the country, providing grants, technical assistance, but also through leveraging our philanthropic relationships to secure and manage resources to support racial justice in education. Over the last 15 years alone, we have committed over 24 million to racial justice campaigns in education, while leveraging and managing an additional 45 million, totaling over 70 million in support. While at Schott, we make every attempt to punch above our weight for students, marginalized parents, and educators. We also know that partnership in this work is essential. To highlight this point, we recently partnered with Candid to provide the philanthropic sector with a mirror which reflects the degree to which foundations are making investments in education, racial equity investments in education, as well as racial justice investments in education. And today, the data, well, the mirror reveals, metaphorically speaking, if foundation investments in racial justice in education were a piano, we are paying for a little more than half of one key. If foundation investments in racial justice in education were an outfit or a suit, we are paying for one button. If foundation investments in racial justice in education were a 10-player softball team, we're paying for less than one player. How then do we expect advocates to build symphonies of education equity, investing in only one note, clothing communities with justice, investing in only one button? And how do we expect our young people to win the game of life when we're not investing in giving them a full team of advocates needed to create loving communities? Simply put, students, marginalized parents, and educators also have and are punching above their weight, but they have not totally achieved equity and definitely not justice, because as a sector, we have not achieved justice. We have not leveled the playing field, and we can. The data reveals that we have not invested deep enough, long enough, and with the right people enough to reasonably expect the results, outcomes, and impact that as a sector we can say is enough to create racial justice in education. Whether those outcomes are closing racial learning gaps or creating racial justice in communities, we have come up short and we can do better. Doing better starts with understanding no one foundation or donor can do this alone. Changing one school alone is not enough. And if the meaning of philanthropy is love for humanity, which it is, then justice has to be and is the foundation. So thank you for joining us today for this discussion. We look forward to you joining us in partnership, because we truly believe that in this sector, justice is the foundation. So let's get things going. And to that end, I want to introduce you to Ms. Leah Austin, the National Director of the Opportunity to Learn Network. Leah.
Thank you, John. Thank you for those opening comments, for reminding us that this is about holding a mirror, that one button won't clothe us. That's not going to work. We need more than one button. And that this is really about love. Really appreciate those opening comments. And thanks to you all for being here. This is an incredible testament to the importance of this topic, that you would take the time out of your busy days to join us for this conversation. As John said, I'm Leah Austin, and I direct our National Opportunity to Learn Network. This is Public Schools Week, and we are kicking off a new initiative called the hashtag Justice is the Foundation Project by releasing new data on racial equity and racial justice funding in education philanthropy. This is the beginning of what will be an ongoing effort to right-size the investments needed for racial justice in education. The commitment that Schott has made for over 30 years of work is to gain support for and increase investment in the work of racial justice in education. We are so excited that you all have joined us for today's conversation. I want to invite you all to be active participants and to make comments and share your experiences and ask questions in the chat box. Please use the hashtag Justice is the Foundation to keep the conversation going. We have moderators on hand who will share your questions with us during the Q&A. And of course, we intend to get to as many questions as we can, but I will share with you that if we cannot get to your question, or if you're interested in further discussion or any advising on this topic, we'll share ways that you can connect with us at the end of the presentation. You can also visit our website at www.schottfoundation.org for more information on the Justice is the Foundation project, on our work, and to learn about our incredible partners, one of whom you will hear from today. The flow of today's conversation intentionally puts people first and lifts up and leans on the expertise of those doing the work. We will approach this the way a really good ethnographer might approach it. Before we get into any quantitative data, numbers, we'll talk to a real live human being. We'll talk to Letha Muhammad, who is the Executive Director of the Education Justice Alliance, about what it means to live, to breathe in this space of working to fundamentally change, transform, and reconstruct the educational experiences of Black and Brown children. Then we will allow the data to undergird those facts. Before I jump into my conversation with Letha, which I'm so excited about, I want to answer the why. I want to answer why would the Schott Foundation take on the Justice is the Foundation project? So we began conversations with Candid at least a year ago about our interest in analyzing education funding data. As an organization that brings together philanthropic partners and community partners, we've been curious about exactly what the investments in racial justice actually look like. We've had mainly anecdotal evidence about this funding strategy, but wanted to dig into the data with a methodology and a rigor that would provide us with what we all know philanthropy loves, the evidence. The urgency to get this done came about in what I'll just say was 2020, and I think everyone will understand what that means. We, like many of you, watched and applauded philanthropy of all kinds, institutional, individuals, families, private, look at their and potentially your own resources and consider how to support racial justice. But we also grew frustrated by the absence of education, and in particular K-12 education, in these discussions and in these funding announcements. We were wondering, where is the investment in the grassroots organizing and movement building that is necessary to create structural, systemic change in perhaps one of the most important systems in our country, the public K-12 education system? With that, I'm going to invite my colleague, partner, and friend, Letha Muhammad, to help us figure that out. Welcome, Letha.
Hey, thanks, Leah. Happy to be here and happy you all invited me into this conversation. Good afternoon, everyone in the listening audience.
Absolutely. We are ecstatic that you are with us. To begin, Letha, can you just tell us about yourself and how you came to this work?
Yep. So I always preference when I get this question, right? I'm a Black mama. I'm a Black mama of Black students, right? I have a 22-year-old that already matriculated through our public education system. I have a 17-year-old daughter who is a senior and will be graduating in a few months. And then my son is 14 and he's in 9th grade. So my experience as their mother in public schools is what brought me to this work. So it's my lived experience. It's our life, right?
Absolutely. I totally, that resonates with me as a Black mama. I have a 6-year-old, just one, but he's like 4 wrapped into one. So that resonates with me. And I always am struck by and appreciative of hearing about the lived experience, because for so many of us, this is not just work that we begin at 9 a.m. and stops at 5 or 5:30 p.m. It is all day, every day. We quite literally live and breathe it both personally and professionally. So always appreciate and note that experience that you're bringing. So can you tell us?
Can I add just one little caveat? I guess to lean fully or more fully into that description, I have to think about my oldest. She entered public schools in the first grade, and it was a major decision for our family to decide if we were going to embark in a public education experience. I'm a product myself of private and public education experiences. And so I put her in with apprehension. I put her in understanding that she had intersecting identities as a Black Muslim girl. And I put her in knowing full well when I looked at the data for her particular elementary school at that time, that Black students weren't performing in terms of testing and numbers as well as their white counterparts. And so, embarking on this journey, I went in, very intentional, where I would be in the classroom all the time. And I started to notice just little things, right? Black boys in her class were always the ones in trouble, or being sent to the one Black male teacher in the school building. When it got time to ensure that academically she was being challenged, the rigor only came when I spoke up about it. I knew who my child was. I knew she was brilliant. I knew she was above grade level, but it wasn't until I asked the teacher for something more that the more became something that was available. And so I started to see, right then and there, my fears of coming to fruition, that if I wasn't a strong advocate for her, what was her experience and the experience of my other children going to be like? And then that thought process, when I started to see the structural thing, right, the ways that it was showing up for all the kids that look like her in the classroom, it broadened for me my sense of purpose and my need to lean into, I have this set of skills, let me help other folks lean into their own power so we can change the system.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue to the next question, which, tell us a little bit more about that leaning in. So how your personal advocacy led you to Education Justice Alliance. And what does that look like in terms of the outcomes you all are hoping to achieve as an organization?
Yeah, so the work started for me through a program through our local YWCA, which was, they had a program in my daughter's middle school at the time called Study Circles, and it was based off of the book Courageous Conversations About Race. And so we took this book and there was a curriculum that was developed, and it brought together parents and administrators and teachers and other support staff in the school to look at the ways in which institutional structural racism had impacted Black and Brown folks in our country in a larger sense, but then drilled it down to the school level. And for me, I'm a Black woman. I've had these experiences with racism and inequity my entire life. But for the first time, I had language to support my experience. And so I joined the Y. They had a parent advocacy work group where they were training parents to be supports for other parents. And I just dove head in. I just was like, this is me. And it was all volunteer work, right? Then the Y lost funding abruptly. We're in this conversation about funding. They lost their funding, and they were an important staple in our community. And there was a group of us who were doing the education, organized and advocacy work. We didn't want it to end. So we decided to come together and form Education Justice Alliance. So, started off really small, no money, just with lots of heart and passion, and really wanting to push our school district, which is in Wake County Public Schools, is the largest school district in North Carolina. It's somewhere around the 13th or 14th largest district in the country, that had huge inequities when we talk about the ways in which Black children in particular, and then at that time was Black boys, were being disciplined and pushed out of the schools. And so the work of Education Justice Alliance is really rooted in changing and dismantling oppressive systems in public schools, right? And achieving justice for our students. Because at the very basis of this, if children aren't even in the school building, they don't have the opportunity to learn. And so we're fighting to stop the over criminalization of Black and brown students in our public education system, to dismantle the school to prison pipeline and the school to deportation pipeline, and end the over criminalization of Black and brown students.
Thank you. Question about, we're obviously talking about racial justice grant making or racial justice funding in education, but want to just broaden it for a second and ask you your thoughts on why education, in particular K-12, is often overlooked in racial justice conversations and discussions. So you just talked about part of your mission is, and I love how unapologetic you said it, is to change oppressive systems. That's what it is, right? And so why, when we're talking about racial justice, is education often absent from that conversation? What are your thoughts on that, Letha?
Yeah, that's a really big why, and it's a why we struggle with as an organization that's working to dismantle and achieve racial justice. Because here's at the crux of the problem, right? Is racism, right? And oftentimes we shy away from really leaning into that conversation because we want to think the world of each other. We want to, say it was accidentally, I was accidentally biased against somebody. I like to lean into the hard conversations and really name what the experience is. And so when I think about thinking about the school to prison pipeline, right? We're thinking about this phenomenon, which when young people are suspended, and in particular, Black and brown young people, with an emphasis on Black, because the way the data, lays out, it's still the majority of students who are suspended and expelled from schools and are referred to the juvenile or criminal justice system. Overwhelmingly, it's Black students, right? With a rise in the numbers for Black girls. The ways in which our young people are being engaged and pushed into this juvenile and criminal adult system is through schools, right? So, and it's rooted in racism. It's rooted in this notion, this idea that people carry into the building, that somehow Black students are less than or more prone to misbehaviors or need to be held at a different level of accountability than their white counterparts, right? That's racial injustice, right? It's all tied together. And I really struggle with understanding the why, but part of that why, I think, is to have these hard conversations, to really name what is happening so that then we can lean into what we need to do to stop it from happening.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right on. And appreciate even the language of leaning into it, because I think that is exactly what we need to do. And that's what this project, this conversation is aiming to do, is to really understand the why, but then, as John said earlier, right, hold a mirror up to say, so now what? We have to do better by Black and brown children. And that is, there's no fancy doctorate way of saying that. At the bottom line, that's what it is. If we love Black and brown children, we have to do better by them. We look at our own children. I have a 6-year-old that's right in the next room, and I can look at him and I can tell you the extremes that I would go to make sure he has everything that he needs. And so we have to bring that same feeling of love to each and every Black and brown child that we're talking about, and again, in the context of the kinds of educational experiences that they have. Can you say a little bit to us about, I know that Education Justice Alliance is focused in North Carolina and has a local focal point there, but I know you, just being the tremendous leader that you are, also affiliated with national organizations like Dignity in Schools campaign and the Alliance for Educational Justice. And so just wanted to ask you a question about, as you all experience the funding community and being able to obtain resources from the philanthropic space, do you see any differences in being a local organization, and a local organization, I'll just add, in the South, In addition to, or as opposed to what you might experience with your affiliations with some of the national organizations?
Yeah. I can say, being rooted in the South, right? My work is definitely Southern based, that there is a difference when it comes to funding, about who gets funded, right? There's oftentimes it feels like less of an investment in funding Southern-based organizations, local and or whether they're just local or national, or even, I'd add to that a caveat, grassroots community-based organizations, because even within my own sphere, right here in Raleigh, I'm a smaller, our organization's smaller, we're grassroots, we're community-based, and we're really just now pushing into some of the state level foundations that fund across North Carolina, and having conversations with foundations locally about the need to resource smaller grassroots community-based organizations. It's this notion, I think, in our world that somehow the South is backwards, bumbling. And I'm not a Southerner by birth, right? I'm a Midwesterner. I hail from the great state of Missouri. That's where I'm from. But I've been here 19 years now. And I definitely see the lack of investment being tied to this idea of what people think about when they think about the South. And I'm just here to tell you that the South is actually full of powerfully brilliant people who are change agents for their communities, right? And, I just encourage philanthropy to think about what it would mean to fully resource individuals like that, who are rooted in community, who are closest to the issues at hand, and actually have solutions, and they just need someone to take a chance at funding them. And I'm not even sure if I answered your question, Leah, but I rolled somewhere with it.
Well, that's what we do. We roll.
Yes.
No, you answered the question perfectly, and you answered it with your experience. So that is the answer. Want to pick up on the last statement you made, really, which was like saying to philanthropy, almost like a mini or a bit of a call to action. And so I just wonder if you could say something more specific to funders or donors that might be joining the call today, about a couple of things. One, what would it mean to invest in racial justice and education, specifically in your work, right? So what do you need? What outcomes would you say if you invest in the Education Justice Alliance and our racial justice work? These are the outcomes. This is the wins maybe that you would be generating.
So we don't get at the wins unless we build authentic relationships, unless we organize our community, right? And so money is needed to do that. Like, we organize from an intergenerational model. We organize with parents, and in particular, working class Black and Brown parents. And then we organize with students. But in order to do that, we're talking about families who have a lack of access to resource. So we are committed to any work that we're doing with families to ensure that we resource them. So there are stipends that we pay our parents and our students for any of the work that they do with us, any of the trainings they attend. We ensure that there is access. So there's babysitting services. We pay for translation services because there is a value for us to organize across communities. So Black and Brown, working class, so that's Latinx and Black folks, we think we're powerful together when we bring each other together. And so we're committed to language justice. So funding to ensure that we can provide interpretation services for our parents, so parents can fully show up, so students can fully show up their whole selves, and that language access isn't a barrier for their participation. And then if we do that, right, if we have the funds to do that, then we're pouring into our parents. So the ways in which I've seen the system work, and this system, I'm talking about our public education system, which is supposed to be this great system that creates space for young people to be fully actualized and changed. But oftentimes for the parents and students that I work with, that isn't the experience, right? It's oftentimes it intimidates people, it marginalizes people, it pushes certain parents, out of the door because the environment isn't welcoming. If you don't have a certain economic status, if you don't have a certain level of education, if you can't show up, you're traumatized because you had traumatic educational experiences. So you're triggered when you walk through the door. And if the environment isn't one that welcomes you, you oftentimes don't participate. Well, we're carving out space and creating space for parents to actually recognize no matter what your experience is, no matter what your economic status is or education experience, your children are your children that you love and you value and that you're an expert on, right? So what would it mean to fully resource organizations like mine that is creating space for parents to grow in their own power? Because we're inherently, I always say, we're subject matter experts when it comes to our children. The system will oftentimes make you feel something different. And then that's why we end up with these outcomes. Some of the reasons we end up with the outcomes where we don't have access to higher level courses, or our kids are suspended or expelled or referred to the criminal justice system at higher rates. But if we resource parents in a way that they understood what their rights are, how to push for structural changes, at the school level, but more importantly, at the district level and even at the state level, we would see a shift in what is happening in our schools. And so I would invite philanthropists that are on this call, donors that are on this call, to lean into that, to recognize that in order to get the structural changes that we deserve, it isn't about just mentoring students, right? Or creating spaces for opportunities. It's actually about systemically changing the inequities that exist that actually don't allow for our young people to have the opportunities that they deserve. And coupled with that, not just the young people, but the parents, because you can't separate parents from students. If something happens to my young person, my son in particular, I remember in 6th grade, he was taking Chinese. The second week of school, he came home and said, "Mama, I don't know about my teacher. I think she's racist." And I said, "Okay, well, we're going to give it some time because, we're a little radical of a family. So let's just make sure we ain't just seeing things from our little radical lens." 4 weeks later, my husband went to meet the teacher tonight. He said, "I don't know about this teacher, Lisa." I said there was a definite difference when she interacted with me compared to the white counterparts or white parents. Fast forward, we ended up having to pull him out because the experience kept being one that was so negative. And she was targeting him. And at the end of the school year, the vice principal comes to me and says, "Yeah, I was right." I said, "Well, I don't actually need your validation. I knew she was racist, but I'm glad you recognized it. And I don't expect her to be back in the school the following year." But I have this way of showing up, and I want other parents to have that too. So I'm rooted and I'm committed to create that space, not only for parents, but for students too, because my son was able to recognize it in 6th grade, 2 weeks into the class, that something's not right here. But it's because we're creating an environment in our house, right, that allows him to have a critical eye on things like that. And so that's the work that Education Justice Alliance is doing in our local community. But there are other organizations across the South and across the United States that's doing that same important work. So it's important for funders to invest in that. And that's how we get to that structural change. That's how we get to justice.
Absolutely. So appreciate this entire conversation. And just want to thank you. We appreciate you being here, but more importantly, appreciate your commitment, your obvious commitment to this work and to Black and Brown children. Letha is going to stick around. So if you have questions for Letha, please submit them in the chat. And again, when we do our Q&A in a few minutes, we are happy to share those questions with Letha. So Letha, thanks you so much again. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Leah.
The question was insightful in that it did exactly what we feel is most important when it comes to data, which is to humanize it and bring it to real life. Our intention was to, in fact, exemplify racial justice in that very conversation. The shift is, two shifts, the power dynamics so that expertise is coming from community voice and leadership. Again, the data is simply a tool to undergird everything that Letha shared with us. She shared the facts with us. The data is now going to undergird that. So with that, let me transition into the presentation of our findings. And if I could get the first slide, that would be awesome. Perfect. So we know that in philanthropy, education is the second most funded issue area. However, this is a broad category, right? So it includes, or it could include, capital campaigns for universities, measurements of teacher effectiveness, and the building of charter schools. What we did not know was what exactly is allocated to reduce inequities so that all students have fair access to a quality K-12 education. And how would we measure that with the data that we have available? So to begin to understand this, we began working with Candid to dive into their data set to identify trends in education philanthropy, particularly around equity and justice. So some of the research questions that we included in our design were, what are the overall trends in education funding broadly and racial equity and justice specifically? How much of K-12 education grant making is related or goes to racial equity? How much of K-12 education grant making goes to racial justice? And where does this K-12 education and, again, philanthropic funding go? These served as the guidance for our research and our analysis. Next slide, please. So where does the data come from? The grants that are referenced in these findings come from Candid's database. And again, Candid is such an awesome resource. They're the leading source of information about philanthropy worldwide. So they compile and combine data from philanthropic giving from IRS filings, direct reporting by grant makers, and public sources like foundation websites, announcements, and news articles. The main data set for the K-12 grant making features grants from US private foundations and public charity grant makers, including community foundations, awarded from the time period of 2017 to 2019. The findings that reference changes in funding over time use Candid's Foundation 1000 set, which is a data set that captures all of grants over $10,000 by a set of 1,000 of the largest US private and community foundations each year. Currently, the most recent data set for the Foundation 1000 is from 2018. Next slide. So as in all research, there are some limitations. And so we wanted to just highlight what we thought were the main three. So the first one was the data periods of time, right? So how recent the data is that we have available to us. There's a lag in data based on the reporting and the sources of information. So it's important to note that given these timestamps, again, 2017 to 2019, we consider this data to be baseline data. We expect to see some changes in the data as foundations continue to submit their actual grant making. And we definitely have an eye of interest around the grant making that's been made for 2020 and 21, and obviously beyond as we continue with this project. A second limitation is around definitions. And so we leaned in on the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity's definitions of racial equity and racial justice in grant making, which we'll go into much more detail in the next slide. But we also acknowledge the limitations that these terms posed when it came to researching education funding in particular. And lastly, limited grants information. So again, the data sets that we are looking at are built based upon grant descriptions. And in some cases, those grant descriptions are missing or they're vague. And then there's also, or there could be limited information about a grantee organization. So for example, we really would have liked to consider whether recipient organizations were BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color led organizations, when we determined grants that were awarded for racial justice work, but that information is not reported for quite a few of the grantee organizations. Next slide. So when it comes to K-12 education, how are we defining racial equity and racial justice? As I just mentioned, we are using the definitions we drew on from the 2019 report, Grantmaking with a Racial Justice Lens, which was written by the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, also known as PRE. So PRE's report advances the idea that racial equity is an important starting point. But racial justice evokes a higher standard. Racial justice brings into view the confrontation of power, the redistribution of resources, and the systemic transformation necessary for real change. Our definitions align with this conceptual distinction. The definition of racial equity in K-12 grant-making is grant-making awarded to benefit people of color in the K-12 education context broadly. It addresses the achievement gap. Often this grant making acknowledges racial disparities in K-12 education outcomes. And as I said, focuses on closing or addressing the achievement gap. Some examples of that might include grants for racial bias trainings for teachers, mentoring programs for students, after school tutoring, and scholarships to low-income students. The definition of racial justice in K-12 grant making advances that to say that it addresses the underlying systems and structures that generate and reinforce racial inequity in K-12 education. It attempts to address the underlying opportunity gap. Examples might be mobilizing parents of color to monitor the use of a racial equity impact tool and to demand and support major changes in their children's education. It might include supporting campaigns to end school policing, disbanding contracts, but then also taking it up a notch so that parents and students and communities are organizing for transparency in the school budgeting. And they're providing recommendations on where and how to reinvest that money, as well as the ongoing monitoring and implementation needed. It's again about building community power and mobilizing communities. Next slide. So what do we consider racial justice in K-12 education? How did we identify grants that aligned with these definitions? What was the search strategy? We looked at keywords and grant descriptions, as well as other relevant coding like recipient names. We also manually reviewed grants in order to further refine the set and ensure alignment with our definitions. So on this slide, what you all see are exact quotes from grant descriptions. Because of the clear intent to disrupt status quo norms of power, to dismantle systemic racism in the education system, these exemplify racial justice. I want to pause, because that was a lot, and there's a lot more, but I want to pause to be really careful to note that this is not an exercise in coding. Our takeaway is not that funders or grantees or prospective grantees should add some key terms and voila, you have racial justice. Next slide. Instead, Instead, what we want to do is reiterate the relationship between racial equity and racial justice. And so we want to, again, and we had lots of conversations, but we're very clear about not wanting to create any sort of false verses between these two concepts. Again, there's a relationship, they work together, they are married to each other. We need one to have the other. So if we apply these concepts, again, if I just lifted up an example around like using data, right? So if we looked at, and this is a real data point, sadly to say, that like 80% of African-American fourth graders scored below proficient in reading. We might cite some inequities in resources. We may say, you know, it's in a low income community. Some folks might say there's lack of parental engagement, insufficient technology, et cetera. Racial equity grant making might focus on the investment in an after-school reading program, whereas a racial justice lens would really strive to understand the racial history of that school community, what have been the impacts of redlining, what's the investment or disinvestment that's evident in that community by lack of green space, grocery stores, etc. Racial justice would also consider the history of and present day use of testing. What does it actually mean to score proficient on a test like the NAEP test? Has it actually been a tool used to ensure equity? But, you know, by and large, we aren't doing that. And that's what this data shows. What we found in our analysis was that funding for racial justice is a sliver. It's the orange dot. It's a sliver of the $14 billion in total K-12 education philanthropy. While 10% of the funding goes to racial equity focused work, less than 1% of that is for racial justice in education. So James Baldwin said, pretty much everything James Baldwin said was brilliant, but one thing that James Baldwin did say was that, you know, with love for country comes an ability to be its greatest critique or critic. So when we look at this data and we honestly reflect on the state of our education system, we have to be willing to offer a critique that is steeped in love. We can do better. We have to do better. Another generation of children, I've mentioned my 6-year-old, so he's included in this. In fact, our country's fate depends on it. We have to level up and see that the systemic transformation we hope to achieve will only come from an investment in racial justice and education. We have to invest in the mobilization, visioning, and sustained power of parents, students, and communities of color, specifically in transforming one of our most, if not the most important institution, our education system. Next slide. From 2011 to 2018, philanthropic giving overall increased by 48%, while K-12 education funding decreased by 7%, and annual K-12 racial equity and justice funding decreased by 36%. We can't continue to see this trajectory and expect to change any other indicators of thriving for Black and brown people. I hear a lot of people say, well, education is just too hard of an issue. And I chuckle and cry because it's a hard issue because it's one of the most important levers that we have for change. Education plays a central role in our intersectional issues and institutions. K-12 education, if you think about it, is the only system that every child has to go through, and it is largely responsible for developing human beings that continue our pursuit to be in a more perfect union. Schools are the one institution in every community with the potential to provide high quality education, emotional and social supports, food security, health supports, and other basic care. The outcomes that we see in education are linked to every other outcome we see in any other area of our lives. We will continue to look at this trend, especially given the funding surge in 2020. How much of that funding actually went to K-12 racial equity and justice in education? Next slide, please. Lastly, where there is investment, funders and recipients in the K-12 racial justice space are disproportionately located in the Northeast. 63% of K-12 racial justice funding is concentrated in the Northeast, while only 16% went to organizations in the South. Meanwhile, nearly half of public school students of color live in the South, around 43%. As someone who has lived and worked in the South for a while, and as Letha clearly stated at the beginning of the presentation, I know personally the battles that organizers and justice leaders in the region have had to deal with. Biases around the intelligence in the South, myth of no infrastructure, when in fact we've seen exactly what the South can do. I have to give a shout out to Georgia. We know the incredible assets that are here. We need to invest heavily in the South. Funders need to partner with organizations that are in, that are of, and that know the South. Quite frankly, organizations like the Schott Foundation. Our future depends on the South. Our public education system shapes our future leaders. This means supporting communities to have the power to envision and demand the excellent public education systems that they want. Systems that culturally affirm them, leverage their brilliance, challenge their thinking, prepare them to live and lead in the future. Investing in racial justice in our education system is the way we get to a just world. We must bend the arc of funding towards justice. Thank you. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Edgar Villanueva, who is the Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy for the Schott Foundation.
Thank you, Leah. And thanks everyone for being here today. We are so proud of this work and all the possibilities and information it gives us to help us do better, frankly. So thank you. I want to remind folks, because we have a lot of questions about the project. You can go to Schott's webpage at schottfoundation.org. We have all of the slides that Leah just shared are there, as well as some frequently asked questions and just a little bit more. If you want to dig a little bit deeper in the information, it's all there. We also invite you to continue to ask questions and to keep this conversation going on social media. We will be continuing to chat there after our time together today using the hashtag #JusticeIsTheFoundation. So thank you so much. I'm going to moderate a couple of questions that have come in and invite my colleagues to the screen to support some responses here. The first question, John, I would love to point to you, is how can larger foundations move in this direction? What are some practical steps you would share with a program officer, a foundation leader, or a trustee?
I think the first thing, and thank you, Letha and Leah for providing us such a robust context. I think the first thing that we have to recognize that it's not an either or proposition. Foundation and philanthropic partners, and especially large foundations, can invest in racial equity in education and racial justice in education, just as we do on the investment side. If you look at our investment portfolios, we invest in bonds and we invest in equities, and we never know which one of those asset classes is going to benefit us the most. It's based on the economy. Likewise, based on the social progress that's happening, you may need that racial equity investment to see the progress, or you may need that racial justice, but we should be in both places. Secondly, I'll just say that we've got to recognize that the work goes, in addition, while it goes hand in hand, investing in racial equity to change the cultural competence or change the pedagogy in the classroom, yes, it makes a significant difference. But at some point, you have to invest in racial justice to go upstream, to begin to determine what is impacting the larger context and experience of students and families that's creating these racial disparities. And my final point is, I think philanthropy and foundations specifically, we can't lose sight of our ultimate leverage point. Our ultimate leverage point is not just our grant making, and we talk about that a lot, but we want to use our grant making as well as our institutional privilege and cachet to get a larger public investment. How can we get states, the federal government, to create racial justice in education and loving communities? That's our ultimate leverage point. That's how we can really make the investments on both sides of the table. You're on mute.
Thanks, John. Leah, is there anything that you want to add into that response before I move forward?
No, you can move forward.
All right, great. Letha, I would love to invite you back. There's a question for you. Tell us what a healthy and helpful funder investment would look like for your work.
Oh, I love that question, right? One that recognizes that I have value, even though my organization is small, even though I may not have a 501c3, but I'm a fiscally sponsored organization. And an investment by a funder would recognize that don't put barriers in place for me to have access to the funds that they're giving out in their foundation. create space for smaller organizations to apply. Recognize that we may not have access to all of the mechanisms to give you metrics, but listen and lean into the work that we're doing, hear our experiences, talk to our community, and then also create space. If you decide to fund us, create space for us to partner with organizations that may be larger, right? Because there's some learning that we can do in those spaces. So that's the kind of investment, but really like be willing to take the chance on organizations that are small, grassroots, community-based organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Letha. Leah, I will invite you in on this question. There are questions about getting into the definitions, which I think may have come in before you sort of put those on the screen. But again, for folks who are asking about the difference between equity and justice, we are using definitions that were put out by the Philanthropic Initiative on Racial Equity. Those are guiding our how we're coding the information with our partner Candid to put grants in those categories. I'll also want to just underscore John's point. We're not pitting equity against justice, right? Both are fantastic, both are needed, and both are under-resourced, right? When you look at the small percentage, only 11%, if you put it together, of education funding goes toward equity or justice. So we have a long ways to go. But Lee, could we give some just practical examples of funding that we would consider to be justice versus equity?
Sure. So one of the examples that I lifted up was around mobilizing parents. And this is an actual grant that we looked at in the research, but it was around mobilizing parents to monitor the use of a racial equity impact tool in a particular school district. And I like this example because I think it does a nice job of combining the two and showing what we do want to continue to reiterate, that this is not about pitting equity against justice. The equity side of it is that this school district received funding to actually create this racial equity impact tool. The justice side of it is now the grant making was awarded to a community-based organization to mobilize and organize and mobilize parents to understand what this tool is, what it is designed to assess, and the impact it's designed to have. And so those parents are now monitoring the use and implementation of this tool. In addition to that, they are using this tool to then demand the improvements that they want to see in their education. So that would be an example. I'll also just add one element to this that we didn't really get to go as deep into, but that part of justice is it's about mobilizing, it's about organizing. It's also about communities of color having the opportunity to envision what we want for ourselves, right? So we're not organizing for the status quo. That's not what we're organizing for. Justice is about also carving, like you could literally fund the carving out of space for parents, students, communities of color to say, you know what, this public education system really was never designed for us in the first place. Here's actually what we want for our children. This is what we want. This is the kind of learning experience that we want our children to have. These are the subjects we want them to learn. This is the type of curriculum that we believe will be not only culturally relevant, but will be responsive and affirming to who they are. That would be an example of something you literally could fund and would be justice work.
Absolutely. We're going to take just one last question here because unfortunately our hour is getting away from us, and anyone or everyone who wants to briefly respond to this question can weigh in before I provide some closing thoughts and next steps here. But the question is, what will it take to fully fund education justice? What will it take? Letha, John, you all are more than welcome to weigh in.
I don't mind starting there. And, if I rephrase the question, what do we hope things will look like, 5 years, 10 years from now? Number one, we would like to see an upward trajectory in funding for racial justice and education. And we would like to see that consistent upward trajectory until we also see an upward trajectory within public dollars. More recently, the Schott Foundation, we called on Congress and the Biden administration to pass a racial justice stimulus package, which hits on a number of those justice issues in education, in criminal justice, in wages. These are the types of pieces that within the philanthropic sector, we have to leverage our dollars to ensure that the public dollars are invested in doing. That's when we will know that we're truly creating loving communities. And that's when we know that we're closer toward achieving racial justice.
Thank you, John. Letha, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just dittoing John, right? It's about investing. It's about actually putting your money, where you say your heart is, or where you believe your value or vision is as a foundation. Like really make a concerted effort to grow those dollars so that they're funding justice and racial equity or racial justice work in the education space.
Thank you. And Leah, any closing comments from you?
Just ditto, but I would also add that we have to be really clear about the important role that education plays in all of our lives. And as, whether you're an education funder or you are, you fund criminal justice reform or health justice or whatever important issue you're taking on, there's something central. It all goes back to public education. It all goes back to education, in particular K-12 education. And so I think there's just also lifting that up and helping. We're willing to help people to really understand how education is such a central issue to every single outcome we're trying to achieve in this work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, as we started this conversation mentioning 2020, right, and we know what all that means, there is a window before all of us for real transformation. We saw in the past year an increase in grassroots activism, and we saw many funders stepping up to fund racial justice, some of them for the very first time. Across the country, young people, old people took to the streets to challenge racial injustice. And communities have proven time and time again that they care, that they are connected, and that they are a driving force for change. For 30 years, Schott has understood this, and we've believed that we will not achieve equity or justice without a powerful grassroots movement led by people of color. We have known anecdotally that the data about this data in our own work, but now we have the evidence, as Leah said, to really confirm what we know is that philanthropy is failing to combat systemic harms that young people are facing in schools, especially students of color. And as Letha said, it's really about racism, not just in terms of what's happening in the system, but also in our own system, right, of philanthropy, systemic and internalized racism that we have to address and dismantle and evolve and change so that we can release these resources to communities of color to do this work of justice. So I'm really excited because I see that we are bending the arc together and that there is a window before us. And I know that we all want to, and we can, and we must do better. There's no question that community organizers and organizations are making a difference. They are leading the way. And it's time for all of us as funders to listen and to follow. Take, for example, a longtime partner of Schott, the Journey for Justice Alliance, which started as a small group of parents who envisioned a public educational system that respects the potential of all children and the rights of parents and youth and communities to participate in all aspects of planning and decision-making. Journey for Justice received its first grant from Schott in 2013 for only $6,000. At that time, they were organizing parents and youth across 12 cities. Fast forward to now, we're supporting Journey for Justice at the tune of about $100,000 annually, and they're now working across 36 cities, Puerto Rico, and even in South Africa. Journey for Justice and Schott and other partners have built power and have shifted policies that will benefit Black and brown children for years to come. One recent highlight, one of my favorite moments was from this last election season when Journey, Schott, and other partners hosted a presidential candidate forum in Pittsburgh on education issues. It was moderated by MSNBC, and we had 7 presidential candidates in participation who received questions and heard the demands of Black and brown parents and youth from across the country. Community leaders who historically have been left out and unheard, thanks to their work, are now not only being heard, but are on the front lines of driving a vision for the future of education that serves all children. Now imagine what could happen if we collectively, as funders for racial justice, funders for equity, funders in the space of education, could move from these shoestring investments from this 10% to fully resourcing racial justice in education. So what's next? Where do we go from here? At Schott, we're going to keep doing what we've always been doing, supporting Black and brown-led partners like Letha, like Journey for Justice, who are advancing racial justice in education through the National Opportunity to Learn Network. We invite you to be allies, co-conspirators, co-investors with us to increase support to racial justice so that we can actually get to equity. We're here to share what we know at Schott, introduce you to community partners, provide consultation, and to co-fund. We are a public fund and we welcome partnerships from any of you all watching. We will continue to build out this Justice is the Foundation project to provide tools, data, resources, and a compass for our collective journey to bend the arc towards justice, including a new web portal and all kinds of fancy tools to track data, because tracking data is important, right? To foster transparency and to hold up a mirror to see if we as the philanthropic sector are giving in a way that truly aligns with our expressed intent, and if we're committed to communities of color beyond this moment. So please stay in touch. Go to our website, take a deep dive into the data, sit with it, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social. But remember that the stories and the faces behind the numbers. Leah's contact information is on the screen there. Please reach out to her if you would like to follow up or meet with any of us to learn more about this project and to explore partnerships. Our public education system shapes our future leaders and all of our futures. So we thank you. We hope that you will stay connected and continue to imagine and invest with us to see what people power can do. Thanks again for joining us today.